No, Prince Andrew is the problem for the monarchy that's just not going to go away. As we've seen with this latest release of the Epstein files from the Department of Justice, it's really made clear that his relationship with Epstein was not only much closer than he'd like to make out, that he didn't break it off.
Behind the lens of a telephoto camera on a cold January morning, something disturbing was unfolding at Windsor. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, stripped of his titles, exiled from public life, facing mounting criminal allegations, was riding a royal horse through Windsor Great Park, smiling, waving at passers-by like nothing had changed. Palace insiders who saw the footage used one word to describe it: unstable. Because while Andrew was performing for an audience that no longer existed, behind the scenes, the royal family was preparing for something drastic. What came next would expose just how far he'd fallen and how little he understood about the reality closing in around him. Staff at Kensington Palace said the tension had been building for weeks. Andrew refused to accept that his old life was over. He'd been given a deadline to vacate Royal Lodge, the sprawling 30-room mansion he'd called home for over 2 decades. The king had stripped him of every title, every honour, every shred of royal identity. Officially, he was just Andrew Mountbatten Windsor now. But according to those who worked closest to the situation, Andrew acted like the whole thing was temporary. Like any day now, someone would realise they'd made a mistake and bring him back into the fold. That delusion shattered on February 2nd, 2020. Under cover of darkness, Andrew was moved out of Royal Lodge ahead of schedule. The midnight flit, as royal watchers quickly dubbed it, wasn't planned. Charles had wanted Andrew gone by spring, but something pushed the timeline forward. Multiple sources pointed to the same trigger: those horse rides. Every time Andrew mounted up and trotted through Windsor Great Park, waving at dog walkers and tourists like he was still the Duke of York, the palace received complaints. The optics were catastrophic. Here was a man facing allegations of leaking state secrets to a convicted sex offender, accusations of propositioning women for threesomes, claims his ex-wife had been romantically involved with Jeffrey Epstein, and he was out there grinning like he was on a royal tour. One senior aide told reporters the behaviour was deeply concerning. Another was more blunt. He looked like he'd lost touch with reality. Charles made the call himself. Andrew had to go, immediately. The convoy left Royal Lodge just after midnight. No fanfare, no press, no goodbye. Andrew was driven nearly 2 hours north to the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where he'd be staying temporarily at Wood Farm, a modest property once favoured by Prince Philip in his final years. It wasn't Andrew's permanent home. That distinction belonged to Marsh Farm, a 5-bedroom house currently under renovation. Located next to a bog at Wolferton, about 1.5 miles from Sandringham House, Marsh Farm was as far from Royal Lodge as you could get physically and symbolically. Reports described it as ramshackle and shoebox-sized compared to the grandeur Andrew had grown accustomed to. Staff who helped with the move said Andrew barely spoke during the journey. One described him as shell-shocked, another said he kept asking when he could return to Windsor. The answer, of course, was never, but Andrew's behaviour at Windsor wasn't the only reason Charles acted. New documents had surfaced, and they were damning. The Epstein files, millions of pages released in tranches over the past months, had already painted a disturbing picture of Andrew's relationship with the convicted sex offender. Emails dated between 2010 and 2011 appeared to show Andrew forwarding confidential government documents to Epstein. These weren't casual notes or personal messages. They were official reports from Andrew's time as UK Trade Envoy a role that carried significant diplomatic weight and access to sensitive information. One email chain started with a message from Amit Patel, one of Andrew's special advisors, to Amanda Thirsk, Andrew's former private secretary. The subject line read, "Visit reports Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen." Minutes after Thirsk received the reports, they were forwarded to another recipient. That recipient was Jeffrey Epstein, and the email was sent from Epstein's New York mansion where Andrew was staying at the time. Then came the Christmas Eve email. On December 24, 2010, Andrew sent Epstein a confidential brief produced by the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The document outlined international investment opportunities in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The email began, J attached as a confidential brief produced by the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Helmand Province for international investment opportunities. Andrew went on to explain he was sharing the document with his network, including contacts in Abu Dhabi, and asked Epstein for comments, views, or ideas on who else might be interested. He signed it, Hor the Duke of York Kiligay. At the time that email was sent, Epstein was a registered sex offender. He'd already been convicted. Andrew knew this. He'd claimed publicly that he travelled to New York in December 2010, specifically to end their friendship in person because he was too honourable to do it over the phone. Yet here he was, sending Epstein classified information about military reconstruction efforts while staying in the man's home. Thames Valley Police confirmed they were now assessing the allegations. A formal complaint had been filed. If the emails were authentic and multiple sources confirmed, Andrew could be facing charges related to breaching the Official Secrets Act. Royal author Andrew Lownie, who'd spent years researching Andrew for his explosive biography entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, told reporters this was the moment for a full reckoning. "I think there needs to be a proper parliamentary investigation into his time as a trade envoy," Lownie said. "I think all the files on his time as a trade envoy should be made publicly available. I think it will reveal just how corrupt he was and how many people like Epstein he was taking on these trips." The National Crime Agency, Lownie added, had been offered evidence. The question now wasn't whether Andrew had done something wrong, it was whether anyone would hold him accountable. But the emails weren't the only bombshell lurking in the Epstein files. Lownie had made another claim, one that sent shockwaves through what remained of Andrew's inner circle. According to the Biographer, the relationship between Andrew, Sarah Ferguson, Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell went far deeper than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Lownie claimed that Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's ex-wife, whom he'd continued living with for decades after their divorce, had been madly in love with Jeffrey Epstein. More than that, Lownie alleged they'd had a sexual relationship. Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, meanwhile, were described as occasional lovers. The web of connections was disturbing. Andrew and Fergie had maintained an unusual post-divorce arrangement, living together at Royal Lodge even as their marriage officially ended in 1990s. For years, the narrative had been that they remained close friends, co-parenting their daughters Beatrice and Eugenie. But if Lownie's claims were true, the dynamic was far more complicated and far darker. New photos released in the Epstein files seemed to support the claims. Images showed Andrew and Fergie together at Epstein properties, smiling, relaxed, part of the inner circle. Other documents suggested Fergie had received financial assistance from Epstein loans, payments, arrangements that were never fully explained. One email referenced a payment Epstein made to help clear some of Ferguson's debts. The timing coincided with Andrew's decision to forward confidential trade documents. It looked less like friendship and more like a transactional relationship. Epstein provided money, Andrew provided access. That arrangement had now collapsed. In early February, as Andrew was being moved to Sandringham, Sarah Ferguson was abroad. Reports confirmed she was in the UAE considering her options. For the first time in over 30 years, she and Andrew were living separately. Sources close to the York family said the decision was mutual, but the strain was obvious. One insider described their relationship as no longer resembling a friendly, divorced couple. The scandal had fractured whatever bond remained, and it wasn't just Fergie who was distancing herself. Princess Eugenie, Andrew's younger daughter, had reportedly cut loose from her father. Publicly, at least, the decision wasn't made lightly. Eugenie co-founded the Anti-Slavery Collective, a charity that works directly with trafficking victims. The optics of being associated with Andrew, a man facing allegations tied to Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking network, were untenable. Eugenie had worked too hard building something meaningful to let her father's scandal destroy it. Sources said Eugenie still loved her father, but she'd made a choice. The charity came first. Princess Beatrice, on the other hand, had taken a different path. She'd stood by Andrew. In the days before his eviction from Royal Lodge, Beatrice was spotted riding horses with her father and her young daughter, Sienna. The photos showed a family trying to hold on to normalcy, even as everything around them crumbled. But even Beatrice's loyalty had limits. Multiple sources described the relationship between Andrew and both his daughters as very strained. Friends of the family told reporters the sisters felt duped. They believed their father's denials, his insistence that he'd done nothing wrong. Now, with each new release of the Epstein files, that belief was harder to maintain. One source close to Beatrice said she was emotionally drained. Another said the situation had created a rift, not just between Andrew and his daughters, but between the sisters themselves. Eugenie's decision to step back had put pressure on Beatrice to do the same. But Beatrice wasn't ready, not yet. The fracture within the York family was just one of many Andrew was facing. Because while his daughters struggled with their loyalty, Andrew himself was reportedly obsessing over something entirely different: his funeral. According to multiple insiders, Andrew had spent years planning his own funeral. It wasn't unusual. Members of the royal family often took an active role in shaping their final send-offs. Prince Philip, for instance, had meticulously planned a no-frills ceremonial funeral at Windsor, avoiding the pomp of a state funeral. Andrew, however, had envisioned the opposite. He'd wanted a grand affair. St. George's Chapel in Windsor packed with dignitaries, television cameras broadcasting to a grieving nation, a procession, honours, tributes befitting a prince. He'd imagined himself lying in state, mourned by thousands. Those plans, sources said, had been put in the shredder. With his titles stripped and his reputation in ruins, there would be no grand funeral, no televised ceremony, no grieving nation. Andrew would be buried as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a private citizen, a footnote in royal history. One source told the Daily Mail that Andrew was raging over the decision. He envisaged a grand affair in St. George's Chapel in Windsor, televised to a grieving nation, but his plans have been put in the shredder, the source said. The fact that Andrew was even thinking about his funeral while facing police investigations, while in exile, while his family distanced themselves, struck many as evidence of just how detached he'd become. Palace officials were thinking the same thing. Reports began circulating that senior members of the royal family were deeply concerned about Andrew's mental health. Prince William in particular was said to be worried. William had long been portrayed as the tough enforcer, the one pushing his father to strip Andrew of his titles and evict him from Royal Lodge. But according to sources, William's concern went beyond punishment. He was genuinely worried that Andrew couldn't cope with what was happening. In the whole Surrey saga, William was often painted as the tough guy urging his father to put his foot down, a source told The Times. This image of ruthless William was, I'm told, wide of the mark. If anything, William was deeply concerned for his uncle's mental health and how Andrew would cope after everything was taken away. Kate Middleton, the source added, supported her husband's concern. But William also understood that concern couldn't override accountability. Andrew had to face the consequences. King Charles, meanwhile, had come to a sobering conclusion. Andrew couldn't be trusted to support himself. Every time he tried to make money independently through business deals, through connections, through leveraging his royal status, it had led to scandal. The solution, Charles decided, was containment. Andrew would receive a modest stipend from the king's private funds. He'd live at Marsh Farm on the Sandringham estate, far from public view. He'd have no official role, no platform, no way to cause further damage. It wasn't mercy, it was damage control. One palace source described the strategy bluntly. The king feels he has no other option than to take sole responsibility for his brother, who will be privately funded. Every time he's tried to support himself by independent means, it has led to greater trouble. Containing him is the hope. Another source used a different word to describe Andrew's current state. Unstable. Royal experts weighed in. Afua Acheampong-Hagan told reporters she wouldn't be surprised if Andrew was struggling mentally, but warned that it couldn't become an excuse. There have long been reports that he is out of touch with reality, she said. But I worry about that being used as an excuse for him not to take accountability. Two things can be true at once. This can be affecting his mental health, but he still has to be held accountable. The accountability question loomed large, because while Andrew was spiralling in Norfolk, the rest of the royal family was picking sides. Princess Anne, the king's only sister, reportedly thought Charles had gone too far. Multiple sources claimed Anne had been vocal with both Charles and William about Andrew's treatment. She believed the eviction, the title stripping, the exile, it was all too harsh. Prince Edward, the youngest sibling, was said to be backing her to some extent. The irony wasn't lost on royal watchers. Edward had been bullied by Andrew as a child. Royal biographer Robert Jobson described Andrew as a bruiser in the nursery, a kid who swiped cakes from his younger brother and overwhelmed him at every turn. Edward had learned early that the path of least resistance was to give in. He'd grown closer to their father, Prince Philip, while Andrew had been their mother's favourite. Now, decades later, Edward was defending the man who'd made his childhood miserable. But not everyone agreed with Anne's assessment. Royal expert Richard Fitzwilliams argued that Charles's brutal approach had been vindicated by every new release of the Epstein files. It was absolutely necessary, Fitzwilliams said. When Edward was asked about the scandal during a trip abroad, he told reporters it was important to remember the victims, a statement Fitzwilliams interpreted as full support for the king's actions. The divisions within the family ran deep, but they paled in comparison to the chasm between Andrew and reality. Royal biographer Andrew Lownie had spent months interviewing sources for Entitled, and his conclusion was damning. "He's such a narcissist that he still doesn't feel the need to apologise," Lownie said. "I don't think he's ever going to accept he's wrong because he suffers from an absolute lack of self-awareness. I think he still feels he's invincible. He sees himself as an innocent man, traduced." Other experts echoed the assessment. Andrew wasn't just in denial. He was incapable of seeing himself clearly. Every scandal, every allegation, every piece of evidence, he reframed it as persecution. He was the victim. The world had turned against him unfairly. That mindset explained the horse rides. It explained the waving. It explained why, even now, Andrew believed his funeral should be a national event. But reality was catching up. The police investigation into the leaked documents was ongoing. Parliamentary calls for a full inquiry into Andrew's time as trade envoy were growing louder. The Epstein files kept coming, each release bringing new details, new allegations, new questions. And Andrew? He was in Norfolk, living in a modest farmhouse next to a bog, stripped of titles, income, purpose. His daughters distanced, his ex-wife abroad. His brother the king keeping him on a tight leash, yet even now, sources said, Andrew believed he'd be vindicated, that one day the truth would come out and he'd be welcomed back, that the funeral he'd planned would still happen, just delayed. It was the kind of delusion that couldn't last, because exile isn't temporary, and the walls weren't closing in, they'd already closed. The only question left was whether Andrew would ever stop waving long enough to notice.